Good evening, everybody. My name is Scott Dwyer, Executive Director of Sons of the Revolution, the state of New York, and its Fraunces Tavern Museum. I want to welcome you all here this evening for our Cloaked Crusader meets Rogue event, launching the book that is the compendium of our current exhibition, Cloaked Crusader, George Washington in Comics and Pop Culture, curated and authored by Renée Witterstaetter. Thank you so much. We celebrated the opening of this exhibition a year ago this month, and what a year it has been. This exhibition has brought a new and exciting burst of color and action into our museum, and a new way of looking at George Washington across the last 100 years of comic and pop culture artworks. And it continues to attract new audiences to our museum. But like all special exhibitions, it's here for a limited time, which is why it's so exciting to now have this book available to us and to all those who want not only to preserve this exhibition, but the history of the American Revolutionary era, which is this museum's mission after all. When we opened Cloaked Crusader in October 2022, we never thought it would bring us an additional connection to our most recent permanent exhibition, which opened in June of this year, the Birch Trials at Fraunces Tavern, but have found that in Lenore Zann, our special guest this evening. I'll let Renée introduce Lenore, but first, I'd now like to turn the program over to Peter Hein, President of Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York, who own and operate Fraunces Tavern Museum. Peter?
Thanks very much, Scott. I really appreciate the effort that Scott and the staff have put into tonight, and also very much appreciate Renée's effort in creating tonight's event. On behalf of Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York, welcome to tonight's special event. We are really pleased to be the venue for the launch of Renée's new book, Cloaked Crusader, George Washington in Comics and Popular Culture. It's a great book. I hope you've all seen it. I got it, and if you would care to have it signed, I think Renée will be glad to do that for you. We are also delighted, as Scott has mentioned, to be able to arrange for Lenore Zann as a special guest for this evening. Lenore spearheaded the effort to create the Black Loyalist Heritage Centre in Nova Scotia. And the permanent exhibit here that Scott alluded to, the Birch Trials at Fraunces Tavern, is right behind the front of this room. And if you haven't seen it, please take a few minutes to see it this evening. It's a terrific exhibit. And so this basically tells the story of the Black Loyalists leaving New York at the end of the war in 1783. And then the Black Loyalist Heritage Centre in Nova Scotia represents the other end of the trip. And Lenore can tell us all much more about that, and really appreciate your being here, Lenore. Renée Witterstaetter is by profession a comic book colorist, editor, producer, and writer. I understand that she's worked on comics such as The Avengers, Spider-Man, and Superman, all of which I seem to recall in one form or another as I was growing up. But Renée is also a great patriot with a deep interest in history, and her current exhibit and this book vividly tells a story of how George Washington has been portrayed in comics and popular culture. It's an interesting story, and one that I think you'll find worthwhile to read and to learn more about. So with that, I'd like to welcome Renée and have her come to the podium. She will speak briefly and then introduce Lenore. Thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you, guys. And I want to say a big thank you to everyone that came here tonight for our all-star team up. As Peter said, and as Scott said, my name is Renée Witterstaetter. I am a member of the Museum and Art Committee here at Fraunces Tavern, and I'm very honored for that. And I would be very remiss if I didn't at this point thank the Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York and my fellow members of the Museum and Art Committee, some of whom are here tonight: Ambrose Richardson, Peter, and also the museum staff. So who is always instrumental in helping all of our exhibits take place and putting nights like this together. And also I do want to thank some people here that were very instrumental in putting together Cloaked Crusader, George Washington in comics and pop culture, namely Kenneth Lopez, art director of DC Comics, and dear person in my life. All of these people are actually, and I could not have done any of this without their support. Kenneth Lopez, Michael Golden, Daniel Scott Jr., award-winning artist Arthur Sudan is also here tonight. None of this would have been possible without them, the book nor the exhibit. So some of you, I'm going to give you a little education on the comic book world, which is my other world when I'm not in my museum world. In the comic book world, when you dress as a comic book character, is called cosplay or costume play. It's short for costume play. What you may not know is that I'm going to try to explain our theme tonight. What you may not know is that tonight I am actually cosplaying as myself. It's right. I am not only a real person, but I'm actually a comic book person and a comic book character. In fact, I'm actually listed in the Marvel database as a comic book character. And this is one of my appearances in the She-Hulk comic book. This is me on the cover here. And the artist drew me in the book all the time. And the funny thing about that is that in the comic book, he would give me this big palatial corner office in Manhattan with floor to ceiling windows. And that was the magic of comic books, because I can guarantee you that was not the reality. I think they called my office at the time, we called it the dungeon, because there were no windows. No one knew that we were there. Like once a year, someone would remember and deliver our mail. But I can guarantee you there were no palatial windows or people bringing me coffee on silver trays. But I am here tonight representing myself, and that is one of the reasons I am wearing this dress. Because in the comic book, I also wore a very similar dress. So my virtual self and my real self welcome you tonight. So I did want to talk a little bit, just briefly, about our theme tonight. Our theme is about bridges, and what we were trying to do is bridge history and pop culture, and I think that's a perfect theme for this evening, because when you think about George Washington, he was a maker of bridges himself. I don't think there's anybody in that period of time that could have done what he did and tie all of these different peoples together, all of these different colonies together, and unite them in the way he did. So that's one of the themes of the exhibit is, why I put forth that George Washington really was our first superhero. But he was the creator of bridges that brought people together. And we would not be here in this country if he were not expert at that, I don't believe. So, so we're talking about bridges, in this case, popular culture, pop culture, and history. And with that in mind, our guest speaker tonight is also someone who is very good at building bridges herself, and also bridging to careers, connecting history with popular culture herself. Lenore Zann is an award-winning actress known universally as the voice of Rogue in the animated cartoon series, which has been voted the #2 comic book series in the world of all time. She's also reprising that role in the upcoming X-Men '97, which I think is currently in production. So that's something to really be looking forward to. But in addition, Lenore was also a member of Parliament in Canada, working for 12 years. And during that time, especially with her work in Nova Scotia, she was instrumental in putting together funding for the Black Loyalist Heritage Museum in Birchtown, Nova Scotia. The reason that's a good bridge for us tonight and the way we're trying to tie all this together is some of you may know just recently this year, we opened our Birch Trials exhibit, which chronicles the events, some of which happened in this building, where after the Revolutionary War, many people that were formerly enslaved had to know if they were being granted their freedom to leave on ships with the British. Some of those decisions happened in this building. And some of those people went to Nova Scotia and are represented in this museum up in Birchtown that Lenore is also involved with, or has been very instrumental in making happen. So without further ado, once again, I thank you all for being here, and let's welcome Lenore Zann.
Wow, that is quite an introduction. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for bringing me here tonight. I want to thank Fraunces Tavern and the board for bringing me in from Nova Scotia. It really means a lot to me to be here because I care deeply about the history of the Black people of America and of Canada and the ties that bind. And when you go down into the roots, you find out that there is so much to be happy and joyful for, and the connections are so powerful and passionate. And it's just an honor, really, to be here and to meet everybody and to give you a little bit of an idea of what happened to the Black Loyalists who were, here in New York and then went on ships to a future they had no idea what it was going to lead to, but they were promised a lot of things. And unfortunately, as has happened throughout history, really, the promise was not necessarily fulfilled in the way that they had been told and sold a bill of goods. First of all, I also want to say that my years in government in Nova Scotia, I spent 10 years as a member of the Legislative Assembly, and that you call us an MLA, member of the Legislative Assembly. That's like a state representative. And in that capacity, for the first 4 years that I was there, my party, which was called the New Democratic Party, was in government. And we put the money into building this beautiful center in Birchtown, which is the Black Loyalist Heritage Museum. And Percy Paris was our Minister of Economic and Rural Development and the Minister of Arts and Culture and Tourism. And he, I would say, was more of a spearhead than I was. I was in the government, but he was a minister. And I was his assistant, his legislative assistant as a member of legislature. And so I got to work with him and save a lot of beautiful old heritage buildings throughout the province, things like this. But one of the things I was the most excited about was the Black Loyalist Heritage Museum. And I did get to go there once it was built and see, the stories that are told and the memorabilia that is there, the artifacts that are there, and to also be told about the suffering of the enslaved people and how they were treated both before they came to Nova Scotia, but also afterwards. So the Birch Trials, I did not know about the Birch Trials until I met Renée in Philadelphia, of all places, which was, the seat of government to begin with here. And we were both invited to a small Comic-Con. Michael Golden was there and I was there as their guests. And Renée and I started talking. I asked her if she knew anything about maybe some history tours. And she was like, oh, yes, you can do this and you can do that. I was like, fabulous. And then we started talking about heritage and history and our love of history. And she told me about this museum. And I told her, well, I'm from Nova Scotia. And, Birchtown is a very important part of the story. So Fast forward, here we are, we're at the New York Comic Con now together, and she's invited me to come here and speak to all of you. Because when the Black Loyalists were put on ships and they went to Nova Scotia, they were promised that they would be given land and their freedom. And they were promised that they would be able to farm that land and, you know, be able to fend for themselves. Well, they got to Nova Scotia, to Shelburne in Nova Scotia, which was part of the British colony. And they were given the rockiest, hardest land with no chance of farming it at all. And basically were left to fend for themselves. The earliest homes that they were able to have there were called pit houses, where they had to dig basically a hole in the ground and cover it with sort of birch bark and twigs and wood pieces of wood and pitch. And it was not at all what they had been promised. And to work and make money, they would accept work that was offered them. But then the whites of Shelburne got upset because they felt that the blacks were taking jobs away from them because they were working for less money, blah, blah, blah. I think we've all heard that story before. And sadly, we're hearing it again. So we had one of the very first race riots in North America took place in Shelburne, Nova Scotia. And the whites of that community attacked the Black community, and people were killed. It was a terrible, terrible event. And so the remaining Black population decided they were getting out of Shelburne, and they went to a spot and they established their own community, which they called Birchtown, after General Birch, who had helped them escape from New York and from America and go to Canada. Now, so some of them established Birchtown and lived and prospered. Some of them decided they didn't want to be there at all, and they went on ships to Sierra Leone, and they established Freetown. Now, so that is another part of history that I think a lot of people don't realize. But so New York, Nova Scotia, Freetown. And of course, and many of the Blacks that were sent to these other places like Sierra Leone, oftentimes were also promised a bill of goods, and yet they were being used to try and quell rebellions that were taking place with the Blacks that already were living in those areas. And so they didn't realize it, but they were used again to try and manipulate and quell and colonialize other Blacks in other colonialized places. So that story, I mean, that's a long story on its own, but it's, again, I feel like they were led down a garden path that did not exist. The Blacks who remained in Nova Scotia, however, they have lived, they have prospered, they have grown, and they are right across Nova Scotia. There are many, many communities. And we have, I think, by per capita, one of the largest Black communities in Canada, in Nova Scotia. And they go way back to these early days. In Truro, where I live, there are 3 areas where the Black Loyalists settled. And many of them can trace their roots right back to New York. And one lady in particular in Amherst, Elizabeth Cook Sumbu, she is a genealogist and she's worked for the government for many, many years. She just retired, and she has so much information that I think you can really use here. And I'm going to put her in touch with all of you so that if you want to track down family members, but also if you want to try and bring her here sometime or arrange, you guys come to Nova Scotia and do a tour and come to Birchtown. The old church is still there, and the Book of Negroes is displayed there with all the names of many of the enslaved people who were given their freedom. And I just have to say, you know, it's a real example of how a people can thrive in the face of dire situations and racism and segregation. And I really feel that we can form a bond and build a bridge between us here and Nova Scotia. And I think you'd all be very, very welcome there to come and check out the history and the heritage and the beauty of Nova Scotia now. And the legislature in Halifax, where we have the oldest legislature in Canada, because Canada was first formed there in the Atlantic provinces with Nova Scotia. And also we have some names, you know, like the Carleton Arms is a place that's in Halifax too, the Carleton Arms and the Carleton Inn, named for Carleton, the same Carleton that you had here. And very, very old historic places. And the other thing that I was going to mention was when the British came there, they also were not particularly friendly to the French, who had already established Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia was actually, the Indigenous people were there for 13,000 years, and they had lots of wonderful things going on. Thank you very much. The French came in 1610, 1614, and the French started with farms, beautiful farms. They got some really good land because they came and they found the land and they farmed it. But after a number of years, the British wanted to take all of Nova Scotia. Fortress Louisbourg was the French crown fort in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, and Halifax was the British main fort. The Citadel in Halifax, that's still in existence as well. And Fortress Louisbourg is still there intact. It's really beautiful. It's just gorgeous. If you ever come, you got to go there too. But so what happened with the British was that they tried to get the French in Nova Scotia to sign treaties saying that they wouldn't fight against the British if there were ever any uprisings there. And the French said, no, we don't want to sign anything with you. We're happy. We're doing our own thing. We don't need you. We're just minding our own business. But Cornwallis was the governor at the time of Nova Scotia, and I'm sure you recognize that name. And he did two things. He put out a lien and said, anybody who can bring me scalps of Indians, Indigenous people, First Nations people, he wanted scalps, which I thought was pretty terrible. And with the French, he ordered the young men and boys and older men in different communities to come and have a meeting in a church, the local church, on a particular day at a particular time. And they said they were going to be having a big announcement. So the men and the boys all went into the churches, and the British soldiers came, marched them off at gunpoint to the ships that were waiting in the harbors. And they separated the families, the men from the women and the children. They separated them, put them on ships and sent them away. Took the women then and the children, sent them on ships and separated them and sent them away. It was called the expulsion of the Acadians. So Nova Scotia was called Acadia before the British came, and they called themselves Acadians. And many of those French ended up being taken to Louisiana, to New Orleans and all those places. And this is how you get Cajuns, Acadians, Acadiens. And that's where you get the French cooking and the beautiful music and washboards and spoons and piano and accordions and fiddles. And some of the families managed to find themselves again and to be reunited, but many of them were not. And this is a very dark period of Canada's history that we need to tell. And the Acadians of Nova Scotia, many did find their way back there eventually. Some escaped into the woods and lived with the First Nations people who they were friends with. And then some came back, and now we have lovely Acadian communities as well. And French is spoken throughout Nova Scotia as well. And again, yeah, another example of how a people can thrive in the face of dire despair. And Cornwallis, there were schools named after him. He had a statue in Halifax, our capital city, but that was taken down a few years ago. The Indigenous peoples said, we don't want to keep looking at him anymore. We don't want him there. And sure enough, he's gone. The schools have been renamed. And oftentimes you have to remind people, you know, this is the same Cornwallis who also treated the Scottish people really badly in Scotland too. He kind of used the same techniques to divide and conquer. And, you know, so the British, they might sound really good here that they have, oh, they gave people their freedom and gave them land. Well, it just didn't quite turn out that way. But Nova Scotia is a beautiful, beautiful province, and we are proud of our Black and our French and our Scottish and Irish heritage, and the planters as well, who came from the New England states and came to Nova Scotia and lived and thrived. So if you ever want to check out a mini series about this, it's called The Book of Negroes. And friends of mine produced it in Nova Scotia, and it's very interesting. So I think it's 6 parts. Cuba Gooding Jr. is in it, and I think he plays Samuel Fraunces. Yeah. So when Renée told me about this place, I said, I have to come. I have to come and check it out and see it. So I'm going to be taking your story back to Nova Scotia. And again, I think we can have a wonderful bridge here between the peoples. And thank you very much for having me, and I'm around and willing to talk about anything and answer any questions later on. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenore. And she is a fount of knowledge on this subject, as you can tell. Not only is she a talented actress, but she's also very versed in history. So guys, there's still a lot to do tonight. The party's going on for 30 more minutes. And those of you that are having the VIP dinner, that will start at 8:30. I forgot to mention a while ago that Michael Golden is here. I know I mentioned his name, but what I didn't say is that he is the co-creator of Rogue. So he and Lenore are very often at the same appearances. So tonight's your opportunity to get a photo with both the creator of the character and the person that voiced the character. It's a unique opportunity. Normally you have to go to a Comic-Con to do that. But we're bringing it to you. We also have a silent auction back there. There are some books by Michael Golden there. There are prints that are signed by me. There are prints that are signed by Michael. A few other items back there, including some 3D prints, which are limited edition. Ed Murr is here sketching for folks. You can wear a tricolor hat, a tri-corner hat if you want to, but you don't have to. No, Ed says you have to. So guys, did anyone have any questions? If not, we'll just we'll continue with the party. Did you have a question, Kenny? Oh, okay. You're just, happens in auctions. Don't ever go to an auction, Kenny. All right, guys. Thank you so much.